Hello, good morning, peace and love to all of our audience. Hello, good morning, Guan.
Hi, good morning.
How are
Good
you?
to see you again. Hi, great to see you.
Today we're going to talk about the war to resist U.S. aggression in Korea.
Also known as the Korean War in the West.
Yes.
Korean Korean War,
Yeah,
different narratives out there. Yeah.
Do you have any special story you want to share with us, which is related to
Yeah,
this topic?
when I look at some of the media reports out there, I think it's fair to say that they're painfully uninformative. I mean, they portray the war, the commemoration as China wanting to pick a fight with the U.S. or China has been hostile. In fact, I don't think that's the case. When I was participating in my king contest, I was 13, 14. And the speech I gave was about an American soldier's last letter. His name is Sullivan Blue. He wrote home to his wife, the very last letter when he was in the trench, because he was about to move in a few days. It's a very touching letter. And I think from that letter, even, back then at the tender age of 13, I learned a whole lot about the fact that, soldiers do die in the wars and there are no winners but losers in wars. So I think wars are bad, and China learned its lesson in the Korean War. So did the U.S. And we should commemorate the dead, memorialize them, but I don't think that is tantamount to wanting a war.
So there's no winners in wars. That's very
losers.
Classic.
Yes, there are no winners but losers in wars.
And also, so we want to show more peace and love to the world, right? Can I teach you some ways to make a heart by your fingers?
How do millennials like you do that, yeah?
From small to big. Okay. It's like from this.
Yeah, in China we do this.
And this. And this.
Okay.
And this. And this. Yeah, so from small to big. Yeah.
Okay, so this.
This.
I do this too sometimes.
This.
And I do video calls with my family.
And use your arms. And the last one.
And this.
Yes. Oh, thank you. And last one. Do you know this? Well, it actually looks like a bird, but I'm imitating a dove.
Dove. Yeah.
Yeah, dove. So peace.
I think Americans do this, right? Or do this.
Yes. All right.
Peace, guys. We'll talk soon. Thank you. Good to see you, Jingjing.
Okay, so a dove flying up to the sky. Peace and love.
Hello and welcome to Headline Buster, brought to you by The Point. I'm Wang Guan, sitting in for Liu Xin. In this series, we dissect stories that are making headlines around the world and talk to my guests to compensate for the missing pieces of the puzzle. So join us in real time by sending us your comments or questions via the CGTN page on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, or Weibo. If you're watching this live on the CGTN app, email us at thepoint with alex@cgtn.com. Let us know what you think. We start our live streaming every Friday at 11 a.m. Beijing time. Get in touch, and we just might read out your comments. This year marks the 70th anniversary of China's response to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea's request to join the war to resist U.S. aggression and aid Korea, also known in the West as the Korean War. China sent 2.9 million of its volunteer soldiers to fight in the war, and almost 3 million of them, unfortunately, died. They lost their lives on the battlefield, according to official numbers. The Korean War was among the most destructive conflicts of the modern era, with around 3 million war fatalities. It is a somber anniversary, one that no country, including China, wants to repeat. Nevertheless, some media are making it sound as if China is gunning for another war with the U.S. China wants to honor its soldier sacrifices, yes, and it wants to protect its national interests and defend itself if necessary. but to suggest that China wants to start another war probably belies the reality. Before we look at our examples, a bit of background here about what the war was all about and why it still mattered today. Let's turn the clock back to Asia in the aftermath of the World War II. That is the map of the East Asia you see over there. On the Korean Peninsula, which had been occupied by Japan during the war, was divided into two parts after Japan surrendered to the Allied troops, after which two separate countries, the DPRK, also known as North Korea, and the Republic of Korea, also known as South Korea, with two ideologically opposed systems, were established. On June 25th, 1950, the Korean War broke out. A few days later, U.S. President Harry Truman ordered ground troops into action by making the United Nations Security Council to adopt a resolution on dispatching a UN force to the Korean Peninsula. The U.S. was able to mobilize a third of its army, half of its navy, and a fifth of its air force to join the fight. Its peak troop strength topped 300,000. 3 months later, U.S. military planes intruded into China's airspace, bombing airports and infrastructure along the China-DPRK border. In October 1950, after that, as requested by the DPRK, China decided to join the fight. The fighting raged on for 3 years. Truce talks, which began in 1951, lasted 2 years and 17 days. By July 1953, the DPRK, China, and the United Nations troops signed an armistice agreement in Panmunjom at the demilitarized zone, but the DPRK refused to sign. Although hostilities ended within 12 hours, there has never been a formal peace treaty. So technically, the war never ended. So why should we care now? Tensions still run deep between the two Koreas and between the DPRK and the U.S., which have seen dramatic fluctuations in their communication since U.S. President Donald Trump and DPRK leader Kim Jong-un first met in Singapore in June 2018. They met again, of course, in the demilitarized zone. China-U.S. friction has also been building on a number of fronts, from Hong Kong to Xinjiang to Huawei, to TikTok, and of course, on the issue of the South China Sea. But to be clear, just because the China-U.S. relations is under stress doesn't necessarily mean that China is looking for a war with the U.S. In the 1950s, the relationship between the two countries was in a very different place. 70 years later, China and the U.S. are linked now by diplomacy, trade, people-to-people connections, and many multilateral organizations. Nobody wants a war right now, especially as the world fights against a far more elusive common enemy, COVID-19. But when you read some of the media reports out there, you get the impression that China is baiting the U.S. into a war, using the 70th anniversary as a provocation or warning to the U.S. that it is ready to start the war if needed. Are these reports accurate? Before we look at our examples, let's set the stage. Along the Yalu River, from the North Korean town of Sinuiju, is the Chinese city of Dandong. A modest memorial sitting on the hilltop in Dandong is one of the few places in China where people can pay tribute to their loved ones who entered the war and never returned. After a long period of renovation, the memorial reopened again to the public in late September, ahead of the 70th anniversary of the war. When Chinese President Xi Jinping visited an exhibition commemorating the anniversary at China's Military Museum in Beijing, he spoke highly of the heroic deeds and revolutionary spirit of the CPV Army, and also urged to make more contributions to safeguarding world peace and promoting the building of a community of shared future. Now, taking a moment to mark the anniversary of a war and to honor soldiers who fought and died in the war is not unique to China. Many, if not most, world leaders do that. But somehow, when China hosts this kind of event, it gets spun into something else. Certain media outlets are so sly at hyping up and speculating over the political significance of an otherwise ordinary tribute to the deceased heroes by a country's leader. And this time, the political significance they assign to it is of an anti-American and anti-West xenophobic kind. A recent piece published by The Diplomat is a case in point. The headline reads, Xi Jinping demands more focus on the war to resist American aggression. Amid the worst downturn in China-U.S. relations in decades, Xi Jinping highlights the one actual conflict fought between the two sides, the Korean War. It says, while attending an exhibit on China's involvement in the war, President Xi Jinping said, the victory in the war to resist U.S. aggression was a victory of justice, a victory of peace, and a victory of the people. He added that the spirit forged during the war will inspire the Chinese people and the Chinese nation to overcome all difficulties and prevail over all enemies. Let's face it, interpreting praises of the sacrifices made by a country's soldier as a provocation of war with another country is far-fetched. According to the article, something much more sinister is at play here. It says Xi did not specifically mention what enemies China might be facing today, instead focusing on the figurative battle for the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. But the subtext was obvious from the literal backdrop to his remarks. The United States, that past enemy, looms large as a present villain. I mean, perhaps the subtext is obvious to someone who already has a predetermined verdict in mind. In recent years, the U.S. has increased pressure on China on multiple fronts, yes, but China most of the times responded in kind and has never really expressed any intent to pick a real fight, a war with the U.S. The fact is, as China's foreign minister put it, China has never provoked a war or conflict, nor has it ever invaded another country or taken a territory over the past 70 years since its founding. How many wars has the U.S. fought in the meanwhile? Our next example makes great claims based on questionable evidence. A recent New York Times article says China ramps up a war of words, warning the U.S. of its red lines. The article is a hodgepodge of tenuously related events connected together to make an impression, a theme, and a narrative that China is turning bellicose and hostile to the West. It talked about a few documentary-style defense-related videos appearing on the internet. It talked about a new Korean War movie featuring Woo Jing, who was the lead actor in another action movie, Wolf Warrior. When you look up how many Hollywood movies have been made about the Korean War, do you know how many are there? 50. Not to mention one of the most popular TV series, which ran from 1972 to 1983, MASH. How many Korean War movies are there in China? 5. If 5 movies and some amateurish internet videos constitute what the New York Times called a torrent of bombast online and in-state media, America's 50 movies and the TV series running a span of 2 decades qualifies as a propaganda tsunami. The point here is that commemorating the people who fought in the war is not the same as wanting another war. China and the U.S. have reconciled on this tragic period of their history. Both countries have moved on and developed strong connections. But that doesn't mean we should forget about our past and our loved ones who never returned. War should not be repeated, but the spirit of peace live on. With that, we'll take a short break, and when we come back, we'll ask our guests what message they think China is sending with its 70th anniversary of this event, and if media is misinterpreting those messages.
It started at the 38th parallel north. On June 25, 1950, the Korean War broke out between the Republic of Korea and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Within 2 days, the U.S. government ordered troops to invade the DPRK and sent its 7th Fleet into China's Taiwan Strait. On July 7th, the United States manipulated the United Nations Security Council to adopt a resolution on dispatching a UN force that it led to the Korean Peninsula. The United States mobilized 1/3 of its army, 1/2 of its navy, and 1/5 of its air force to join the war. Its peak troop strength topped 300,000. On September 15th, the U.S. forces conducted the Incheon landing, forcing the DPRK forces to retreat. Meanwhile, U.S. military planes intruded into China's airspace, bombing airports and infrastructure along its border with the DPRK. Do not step across the 38th parallel, China repeatedly cautioned. But the United States ignored the warning. Its army poured across the line on October 7th and pressed on towards the Sino-Korean border. The next day, at a time when China's national security was threatened and upon receiving then DPRK leader Kim Il-sung's urgent request for aid, the Chinese People's Volunteers, or CPV, was formed. On October 19th, the CPV crossed the Yalu River to fight together with the DPRK army. It could have been a one-sided war. In 1950, China's industrial and agricultural output was only 1/12 of the U.S. total, while its steel output was only 1 out of 144th of the U.S. total. During the war, the U.S. military used all the latest weapons, while the CPV mainly relied on infantry and limited artillery. The two sides were heavily mismatched in weapons, equipment, logistics, and food supplies. But what happened next was beyond expectation. On October 25th, the CPV launched the first battle, driving back the enemy forces to the Changcheng River. On November 7th, the second battle started. It ended with the US-led army retreating to south of the 38th parallel. Up to June 1951, the CPV launched 5 major battles in 7 months and inflicted heavy losses on the UN force led by the United States, and essentially fixed the front around the 38th parallel. On July 10, 1951, the first truce talks began at Kaesong, near the 38th parallel. For the next 2 years, the Korean War continued as a stalemate. Both negotiations and combat went on. On October 14, 1952, the Battle of Triangle Hill began. It was a hill covering 3.7 square kilometers. The United States had planned to seize the area with 2 battalions in 5 days at the expense of 200 casualties. But it ultimately cost 60,000 troops, 43 days, and 25,000 casualties before the battle ended.
Over 11,000 CPV soldiers were wounded or killed in the battle.
On July 27, 1953, the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed in the village of Panmunjom, ending the 33 months of the war to resist U.S. aggression and aid Korea. According to China's official release, more than 1.093 million enemy combatants were killed, wounded, or captured. In the United States, the Korean War has been called the Forgotten War. To protect their motherland, a total of 2.9 million CPV soldiers entered the battlefield, and 197,653 sacrificed their lives, according to the latest data. For China, history will never be forgotten, and the heroes will be remembered.
Welcome back, guys. I want to bring in our guests for today's discussion. They are Liu Xiang, Research Fellow at Chinese Academy of Social Science, and Ian Goodrum, Senior Editor and columnist at China Daily. And last but not least, Brendan Blackburn-Dwyer, President of Grasshopper Strategies. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Brendan, let me start with you. China is celebrating the 70th anniversary of the Korean War in a grand style. Is Beijing sending a message, and if so, to whom?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that this is standard business, okay? No one accused the United States of picking a diplomatic or military fight with Germany when they observed the 70th anniversary of D-Day. No one has questioned the ability of any country in the world to honor its fallen soldiers, and particularly an event as deadly as the Korean War, I believe it deserves multiple memorials, including many that have happened in the United States and around the world. The problem is, I don't think it's just that simple, right? Nothing is ever that simple. In Asia particularly, when we've seen entire diplomatic rifts that have lasted months, if not years, between countries because leaders of one country went to a certain shrine, we always have to see what is the broader message, what is the broader context. And the reality is the broader context comes at a time of heightened tensions between the United States and China, comes at a time of questionable relations across the Korean Peninsula, and come alongside a number of other questionable actions on both the United States and the Chinese media's parts to stoke concerns on all sides. So at its core, there's nothing wrong with this memorial. At its core, every country should be able to celebrate its fallen heroes, celebrate its past, memorialize, and hope for a world where we do not need destructive wars like this, but it's never that simple.
Are you saying that it's a deterrent strategy of some sort to Washington, Brendan?
I think that there is a broader message at play, that when you choose to do a memorial like this, that you can play up certain angles of it. And whether it's trying to parse through President Xi Jinping's speech, or whether it's trying to parse the timing of PLA videos that are generally propagandist and show one now deleted video that showed a bombing of U.S. territories in Guam, you have to ask about the timing. You have to say, is this saber rattling? Is this about a broader geopolitical argument? Is this harkening back to an era where China can say, see, here was a time where we fought the United States and won, and we can continue this struggle forever. That's the concern, right? But again, at the core, the event itself is not the problem. The problem is, what is the lens around it, and what is the emphasis being put upon it, either in Chinese media or by Chinese leadership or by the military.
Mr. Liu, what do you think? What are the significance and also the messages that China is trying to send by memorializing this event?
Oh yes, Wang Guan. I just watched the live speech of President Xi, and I have some personal affection to this kind of commemoration because my father was a soldier in the Korean Peninsula at that time. From 1952 to even after the war, he was there until 1956. So from my childhood, I heard a lot about this war. It was the largest scale war between the new China and a foreign force. And it still left a lot of experience and lessons and messages to us. It means to me. It means two things. First, China will now, the new China, the People's Republic of China, will never be compromised by the bullying and provocation or even aggression from a foreign force. At that time, actually the decision to cross the Yalu River was the most difficult decision since the founding of the new China, because that time, China was very weak. Our army, we only have our army, and we don't have air force. We didn't have navy. So we were facing a very, very strong aggressor, but the leadership made a very difficult decision and send our troops to the peninsula and to assist the Korean people and resist the strong army. So even today, it's a signal for China that now we are much stronger than that time. But compared with the United States, we are still weaker. But even if we are weaker, we are not afraid of a fight. But although we will never pick a fight. So that's the message. The second message is that China actually has a responsibility for the security in the surrounding countries of our country. So the war broke out in Korea, but it was a very great threat to our security. So China needs to take care of that. So today, this is the same. In the South China Sea, in other areas around our country, if there occurs kind of unrest or kind of war or any kind of conflict, China is not an outsider. So this is a message I got from President Xi's speech.
Right, Ian. How do you look at this? What are the messages that you have picked up?
Well, I mean, it's true that it's a standard remembrance, as Brandon said, but we have to consider the context that Mr. Liu also referred to, because this was not. You see, the myth of foreign aggression is the foundational myth of U.S. foreign policy. The idea that there is some enemy out there preparing to strike, preparing to attack, animates practically every decision made by the U.S. government. It's used to justify all kinds of preemptive attacks. It's used to justify all kinds of invasions, all kinds of sanctions, all kinds of violations of sovereignty. And the context of this cannot be removed from the context of the broader history in which the U.S. has engaged itself. The Korean War, the Chinese name being the War to Resist U.S. Aggression and Aid Korea, it's a very accurate name, because we remember that the division itself along the 38th parallel was a decision by the U.S. military, and the creation of a U.S. military government in the South, and the propping up of an unpopular government in the South, and in the constant threats of invasion and aggression from the South to the North, animated the conflict and created the tensions that led to the war itself. So considering that, we have to understand that any commemoration of this particular war, this represents, as do many of the anti-colonial struggles of the 20th century, this resistance to the imposition of American will on sovereign nations, the imposition of U.S. rules and U.S. strictures on countries that might want to go their own way, as Korea was doing before the division happened. So this obviously has a lot of resonance right now. It has a lot of resonance. It has for the last 100 years, the last 70 years, the PRC's history. It will always be relevant. But the fact of the matter is, these attempts to gin up the idea of Chinese aggression are based on practically nothing. We have to remember, as you referred to earlier, that China has not willfully invaded another country, and it's been 40 years since Chinese military has been in open armed conflict with another country. 40 years.
Yeah, 41 years to be exact.
That the relevant point here is that in the United States' 244-year history, there have only been 18 years at which the U.S. was not at war at some point during that time. So that's less than half the amount of time since China was last in armed conflict throughout the entire almost 250-year history of the United States. So who's the aggressor in this scenario? That's what we have to ask ourselves.
May I jump in here?
Yeah, Brandon, pick it up.
I mean, I'm fascinated by a couple of different things here. Let's get the history correct. First of all, prior to the division that was apparently engineered by the U.S. military, which it wasn't, South Korea and North Korea, the Korean Peninsula, were run by the Japanese since 1910. Because it had been so long since the Japanese had taken over the Korean Peninsula, there was no government in exile. So we basically removed 700,000 Japanese citizens from the Korean Peninsula, leaving behind a vacuum of power. It was not the U.S. military that made the decision. It were great powers, including the Soviet Union, who took over administration of the northern half and agreed upon the division of the country. You're
leaving out a very key point. You're leaving out a very key point here.
Ian, thank you. We're looking at a situation where Kim Il-sung, during this period, was a major in the military. He wasn't even an influential player on the field who eventually rose to run North Korea. We then have a period of mutual tensions building, and we have the Northern Korean forces under Kim Il-sung invading the South. We then have the U.S. pushing back to 30th parallel, pushing into the North, which then triggered the Chinese to enter, which then pushed the United States back into the South with Chinese forces invading the South. And then we had the line reestablished about the 30th parallel. So this is one of these wars that no one likes to talk about because the United States doesn't like to admit that it invaded the South, in the North. We don't like to admit that. We also don't like to admit that we got pushed back twice. The Chinese don't like to talk about the fact that they pushed past the 38th parallel and then got pushed out of South Korea. It's one of these wars that everyone likes to talk about the fact that, hey, we all had justification on our side. No one really likes how it ended, except for the fact that it ended, because it stopped the killing of civilians.
Well,
interesting. Interesting. I went to South Korea in 2008. North Korea, actually, and the North Koreans told me that the South fired the first shot, but being in the U.S. for the past 8 years, the narrative is largely surrounding, Kim Il-sung fired the first shot, but it's very different, narratives out there, certainly disputed.
Again, where were the troops? The troops from the North had almost completely pushed UN South Korean forces out of the Korean Peninsula. So that's fact, right? So if you're looking at who crossed the line, that was the fact. Now, let's fast forward to...
I think both sides crossed the line at some point, and, the North was having the momentum. They had their moments, right? But then, with help of the U.S. troops, it pushed all the way to the China DPRK border, to the town of Sinuiju, which I've also been in 2009. Let's put history aside, folks. Of course, there are many versions of history. China's Global Times. I want to ask Mr. Liu. China's Global Times argues that the U.S. failed to figure out the message from the Chinese side, meaning 60, 70 years ago during the Korean War, that China will not sit still if the U.S. Army crossed the 38th parallel. It has also underestimated China's determination to safeguard its national security. So, Mr. Liu, do you think this is a message to Washington that don't mess with China, don't mess with South China Sea, don't mess with Taiwan?
Okay, so first, let me talk a little about the origins of the war. Actually, first of all, the war between the North and the South was a civil war. And before that, there had been a lot of conflicts between the two parties. But no matter what it was, it's a civil war. Actually, China didn't want to intervene into that civil war. Only after the U.S. forces and some the force of the U.S. and some allies came closer to the Chinese border, we send our troops there to fight the war. So that's the essence of the Chinese involvement in the Korean Peninsula. So in today's conflict, it's very clear some elements in the United States are trying to drag China into kind of conflict, whether it's in the South China Sea or Taiwan Strait or even the Northeast Asia. So I don't think the U.S. government already has a plan to do that. But we heard a lot of voices or even noises in the United States, which seems they like to drag China.
Well, Mr. Lee, I don't think it would have great signal over there.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, we will never be compromised by any of these kind of hostile actions.
Brendan, it looks like you're also, passionate about history. So am I. Let's talk about President Harry Truman. Why would he send the 7th Fleet to the Taiwan Strait once, China decided to join the fight? Is that a strategic miscalculation? I mean, he thought about the domino effect and the fact that China, once joining the fight, can be linked to the Soviet Union, under the Soviet umbrella. Is that a, exaggeration of the situation? Is that a strategic miscalculation by Harry Truman?
Sending the fleet to the Taiwan Strait, I don't think was a miscalculation, to be honest. I know that it added provocation, but we're looking at a situation where we was really the genesis of the domino theory on both sides. Well, the domino theory became much more popular after Harry S. Truman. You can see its germination literally on both sides. You can see the Soviet Union, you can see early China, the early PRC being very concerned about if North Korea falls and America either pushes into China or simply just removes a burgeoning communist other instability in the area. I'm not saying that they're the first ones who come up with this. I mean, the United States saw that same prism when we were talking about Vietnam and led to, I think, a lot of bloodshed that was unnecessary during the 20th century. But at the period, everyone was making moves. China was relatively unknown power at the time. China massively upgraded its military over an incredibly short period of time, performed, I think, objectively from the military perspective, much better in the fight than the United States had thought was going to happen. Both sides sort of underestimated and overestimated each other at both times. Hence, a battle that went back and forth across the peninsula 2 and 3 different times. That's an element. Whether individual steps were a misstep, if I was going to pick one, I wouldn't go with the 7th Fleet. I would pushing to go past the 38th parallel. The United States has simply stopped at 38th parallel after the initial invasion. I think we'd be talking about a very different Asia today.
I mean, Ian, what do you think? Do you agree?
Well, I just want to circle back for a second because Brandon was suggesting a sort of unbroken line between Japanese occupation and the division of Korea by the Soviet civil administration and the U.S. military government. What we actually had was we had a brief period when the Japanese left, where the Koreans were self-actualizing and creating what were these kind of quasi or proto-governmental units called people's committees in both the North and the South. Now, the difference between what happened when both militaries went into the peninsula was these committees were the, as I said, these proto-governmental units that were laying the groundwork for a provisional government that was known as the People's Republic of Korea. Now, when the U.S. came in, they got rid of those people's committees and they established their own structure. When the Soviets came in, structure relatively intact. So that's the difference, I think, in terms of what we're talking about with the division. That's what I was referring to. As far as what Brandon was discussing, I mean, it's he mentions MacArthur. It's interesting to me also because MacArthur at one point was jostling or jockeying or whatever word you want to use to potentially use nuclear weapons in the North, potentially in parts of China.
Yeah, he was stopped,
That's a very scary
barely stopped by Harry Truman, who was at odds with him.
Right, exactly. So we were that close to another use of nuclear weapons in armed conflict, which I will remind everyone, the United States is the only country to do that in the history of the world. It does not have no first use policy. So when we're talking about how the history of this conflict fits into how we broadly understand geopolitics and international relations, certainly past is prologue, and certainly we can take some hints, but it's interesting to see how the kind of messaging of these conflicts gets manipulated and twisted to serve specific interests. So inconvenient facts are ignored. Convenient facts are emphasized. So I don't. As I say, I agree with Brandon that I don't think there was some original sin in the conflict, but I do think that there is a certain element of narrative building that takes place in the West that should be reckoned with if we're to have an honest conversation about this and other conflicts.
Dr. Lee, I saw you nodding your head over there. What do you think?
Yes, actually, we have to note that the U.S. government that time, especially the military leader in Asia, MacArthur, underestimated and he fatally ignored China's warnings. Strategically speaking, China was very transparent at that time. Chairman Mao and Prime Minister Zhou gave a lot of warnings to the U.S. If you crossed the 38 parallel, we will send our troops. We will be involved. We will send our troops. So that's they didn't pay any attention. They thought that's bluffing. So that's a fatal mistake on the U.S. side. So for the Chinese part, on the Chinese part, strategically we are transparent, but technically, actually we did a lot of preparations. So when the U.S. troops went closer to Yalu River, so we started our resistance war. So that's the truth.
Yeah, Dr. Liu, let's focus on the present. What do you think the lessons of the Korean War can inform the current policymakers, leaders in Beijing and Washington?
Yeah, for the Washington strategic decision makers, it's very clear. Stop any kind of imagination. The U.S. can bully China now. Yeah, now, just as I said, even if we are strategically we are weaker in terms of the overall capabilities, we are weaker than the U.S. But we will never be compromised by any kind of bullying, by any kind of aggression actions. So that's the most clear message to the U.S. government.
All right, guys, thank you so much. Fascinating discussion. Ian, Brandon, and Dr. Lee, thank you all so much for joining us today.
Okay, thank you, Wang Guan.
Thank you. Then that will do it for this edition of Headline Buster, brought to you by The Point. Thank you all so very much for tuning in. I'll hopefully see you next week. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Hi. Let's see what our viewers are saying about all this. Oh. 谢谢您，刘老师. Thank you. You can go back to watch the debate or the speech. Oh yeah, perfect timing. Okay, let's see what our friends are saying. 外国朋友布雷特 said, agreed, Freddie, Zionism is pure evil. Oh, that's a harsh remark. Let's see. Zen Chill said, of the free and the home of the brave on the shore, dimly seen through the mists of the deep. What is that which is the breeze or the tower? I think that's a poem, a readapted version of the poem. Okay, let's see. Nana Huang said, Chinese soldiers can learn from the Korean War. Okay. Angeline J said, in fact, U.S. has detention camps at the border and treated refugees badly. Paulo Roberto said, don't read the bots. I try not to, but sometimes it's.
We also have one person from the YouTube. His name is Stephen Park. He said this.
Oh, let's see.
Yeah.
Stephen Perk said, this is interesting for me because I used to be one-sided as an Australian citizen, but looks like there's more to the story than what I was told growing up. Interesting. Thank you. Angeline J says, support CGTN, tell the truth. Thank you, Angeline. What else? We have folks sending multiple questions. Okay, let's see. What else? Angeline J said, it's meaningless for US to smear others by fake news. Sawayaka said, hello to you back. Yeah, people are talking about the coronavirus, Dan Go said, why US had so many people died from COVID? It's really unfortunate and tragic, and I don't know why, to be honest. I want to find out. What do we have? So keep your comments coming, and we have this friend, Gui Shuro. Greetings from Brazil. I hope we get your vaccine after all. I was hanging out with a Brazilian friend of mine last night, actually, and we're talking about the vaccine and China-Brazil relations. Greetings to your friends in Brazil. Oi, Brazil. Tudo bem? Thank you, our friend from Brazil. We love Brazil. I was there twice, for the World Cup and the Olympics. I loved it. Okay, friends from around the world, thank you all so very much. Keep your comments and questions coming. Hopefully, I'll see you next week. All right?
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Cool.
Nice.
All right. So, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care. Bye.